Picture a paradise on the coast of Portugal. Golden sands, warm evenings, and the laughter of families enjoying the perfect escape. It was supposed to be a week of relaxation for a group of doctors and their friends. But on one fateful night in May of 2007, that paradise turned into a global mystery that haunts the world to this day. While her parents dined just 50 meters away, a window in apartment 5A was opened, and a 3-year-old girl vanished into the silence of the night. In the time it took to finish a meal, a life was erased, leaving behind no physical trace, only a sleeping twin brother and sister, and a cold, empty bed. Was this the work of a calculated predator watching from the shadows? Or was it, as some detectives later theorized, a tragic accident covered up in a panic by the very people supposed to protect her? This is not just a story about a disappearance. It is a labyrinth involving 12,000 pages of police files, suspects ranging from local residents to international drifters, and an investigation that has cost more than $15 million. Today, we are opening the dossier to separate the facts from the media frenzy. But before we step into the timeline that changed everything, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue to investigate these complex stories and bring the truth to light. Now, let us return to the night it all began. In May of 2007, the coastal town of Praia da Luz in the Algarve region of Portugal presented itself as an idyllic sanctuary for holidaymakers. Known for its golden cliffs and calm waters, the area had cultivated a reputation as a safe and charming destination, particularly favored by British and German tourists seeking respite from their busy lives. The atmosphere was one of relaxed leisure, a place where the rigid schedules of professional life could be traded for the slow rhythm of the ocean tides. It was into this picturesque setting that a group of doctors and professionals from the United Kingdom arrived, anticipating a week of rest and family bonding. At the center of this narrative is a family from Leicestershire. The father, a 38-year-old cardiologist at Glenfield Hospital, and the mother, a 37-year-old general practitioner who had previously worked in anesthesiology, were looking forward to a break. They had met years earlier, in 1993, while studying at the University of Leicester's School of Medicine. By 2007, they had established a stable, seemingly perfect life with 3 young family members, an eldest daughter and 2 younger siblings, who were twins. The eldest daughter was often described by those who knew her as possessing an energetic, adventurous, and extroverted personality, a bright presence within the family unit. The family did not travel alone. They were part of a larger entourage that would later become known in the media as the Tapas 7. This group consisted of close friends and colleagues, including Jane Tanner, Russell O'Brien, Fiona and David Payne, Matthew and Rachel Oldfield, and Diane Webster. Together, the group brought along 8 young family members in total. They checked into the Ocean Club, a sprawling tourist complex that many previous visitors had highly recommended as a secure environment appropriate for families of the middle class. From an investigative perspective, the social dynamics of this group are crucial. They were highly educated, responsible professionals who operated with a collective mindset. Analysis of their behavior suggests a phenomenon often seen in resort tourism: the lowering of individual guard due to the perceived safety of the bubble. When travelers enter a resort, especially one populated by fellow nationals, there is often a psychological shift where the external dangers of the world feel suspended. This false sense of security would play a pivotal role in the decisions made regarding the supervision of the young ones during the evenings. The family was allocated apartment 5A, a ground-floor unit located within the complex. The location of this apartment is a detail that has been scrutinized by investigators for nearly 2 decades. Situated on the ground floor, it was accessible, and crucially, it sat adjacent to a public street. This accessibility, while convenient for poolside access, also meant that the boundary between the private, safe space of the apartment and the public, uncontrolled space of the road was merely a window or a door away. The daily routine established by the group was structured around leisure. Mornings were spent engaging in resort activities and swimming, while afternoons were for rest. However, It was the evening routine that would become the focal point of the global investigation. Every night, the adults would dine at a tapas restaurant located inside the resort complex. On the evening of May 3rd, 2007, the routine proceeded as it had on previous nights. Around 8:30 in the evening, the parents placed their 3 young family members to sleep in the bedroom of apartment 5A. The parents then joined their friends at the tapas restaurant. The restaurant was situated approximately 50 meters away from the apartment where the young ones were sleeping. This distance 50 meters is perhaps the most debated measurement in the history of the case. In the daylight, 50 meters is a short, visible walk. In the darkness of the evening, with the noise of conversation and dining, that distance creates a significant auditory and visual gap. To bridge this gap, the group devised a checking system. They did not employ a sitting service or an external guardian to stay inside the room. Instead, the friends agreed to take turns leaving the dinner table every 20 or 30 minutes to walk back to the apartments and visually check on the young ones. Looking back with the benefit of hindsight, experts and the public alike have questioned the wisdom of this arrangement. Why would a group of medical professionals, individuals trained to assess risk, leave young family members alone in an unlocked or semi-secure apartment, even for short intervals? Sociological analysis suggests that this decision was not born out of negligence in the traditional sense, but out of a collective reinforcement of safety. Because they were in a group, and because the resort felt like an extension of their home, the perception of risk was drastically minimized. They likely believed that a check every 20 minutes was sufficient to mitigate any potential problems. They were operating under the assumption that the only risks were internal, young one waking up and crying rather than external threats, such as an intruder. Furthermore, the restaurant was technically within the complex, which allowed the parents to feel they were just nearby. However, criminal analysts point out that a predator or an opportunist only requires a window of a few minutes, far less than the 20-minute intervals between checks to act. The safety provided by the checking system was, in reality, an illusion. It provided peace of mind to the parents dining at the table, but it offered no physical barrier or immediate protection to the young family members sleeping in apartment 5A. As the sun set on that Thursday evening, the atmosphere at the Ocean Club was tranquil. The weather was mild, typical for spring in the Algarve. Witnesses and staff at the resort described the group as relaxed, enjoying their food and wine, unaware that the clock was ticking down to a moment that would shatter their lives and capture the attention of the world. The layout of the resort, with its winding paths and scattered accommodations, meant that while the area felt private, it was actually quite porous. Anyone could walk along the streets bordering the apartments. This open design, which contributed to the resort's airy and free feeling, also meant that surveillance was difficult. There were no high walls sealing off the blocks from the public road completely, and the lighting in certain areas was soft, designed for ambiance rather than security. In this first chapter of the story, we see a picture of normalcy. We see a family and their friends enjoying the privileges of their hard work, trusting in the environment around them. But beneath this veneer of a perfect holiday, the variables for a tragedy were aligning. A ground-floor apartment, a predictable routine, a periodic gap in supervision, and a public location accessible to anyone passing by. The stage was set not by malice on the part of the family, but by a series of choices that left a door of opportunity slightly ajar. The events of May 3rd, 2007 have been reconstructed minute by investigators, journalists, and the individuals involved. This timeline serves as the backbone of the entire case, establishing the window of opportunity for the disappearance and highlighting the procedural decisions that would later come under intense scrutiny. As the evening approached, the family adhered to the routine they had established during their holiday. At approximately 8:30 in the evening, the parents placed their 3 young family members to sleep in the bedroom of apartment 5A. The apartment was situated on the ground floor of the tourist complex, a location that offered easy access but, as analysts would later point out, also presented vulnerabilities regarding security. The eldest daughter, along with her 2 younger siblings, was left in the room as the parents prepared to join their friends for dinner. Once the young ones were asleep, the parents departed the apartment and walked to the tapas restaurant located within the resort complex. The distance between the sleeping quarters and the dining area was approximately 50 meters. This spatial relationship is critical to understanding the parents' mindset. They were physically close enough to feel present, yet separated by physical barriers and the ambient noise of a social setting. To ensure the safety of the young family members, the group of friends, later dubbed the Tapas 7, implemented a rotation system for supervision. Rather than hiring an external guardian or staying in the room, they agreed to take turns leaving the table every 20 to 30 minutes to physically check on the apartments. This method was intended to balance their desire for a social evening with their responsibilities as guardians. However, security experts have since criticized this approach, noting that it created predictable gaps in surveillance intervals of time where the apartment was essentially unmonitored. The evening progressed, with the adults dining and conversing, unaware of any disturbance. Various members of the group performed their checks without reporting any issues during the early part of the dinner service. However, the timeline fractures at 10 o'clock in the evening. At this hour, the mother left the table to conduct her scheduled check on the family members. Upon entering the apartment, she immediately noticed an anomaly. According to her later statements to the authorities and the media, she observed that the window of the bedroom was open. This was highly unusual, as the parents were certain the window had been closed prior to them leaving for dinner. The situation escalated rapidly. As she stood in the room, a strong gust of wind slammed the door shut, emphasizing the fact that the space was no longer sealed. In that moment of confusion and dawning realization, she looked for the eldest daughter. The bed was empty. While the two younger siblings remained asleep, the eldest daughter was gone. The discovery triggered immediate panic. The mother returned to the restaurant to alert the father and the rest of the group. The quiet atmosphere of the resort was shattered as the reality of the situation took hold. The parents, aided by their friends and resort staff, began a frantic search of the immediate premises. They scoured the apartment, checking wardrobes and under beds, hoping the young family member had simply wandered off or was hiding. When those initial checks yielded no results, the search expanded to the wider complex. Staff members and other guests joined the effort, calling out the name of the missing individual and combing through the swimming pool area, the gardens, and the surrounding pathways. During this chaotic period, the parents recalled a specific detail from earlier that day. During breakfast, the eldest daughter had asked why they had not come to the room the previous night when she and her siblings were crying. This comment, initially dismissed or perhaps misunderstood, took on a haunting significance in the wake of her disappearance. It suggested to the parents and later to investigators that the young family members might have been disturbed or observed on nights prior to the event. A significant point of contention in the subsequent analysis of the case is the response time of the local authorities. The local police did not arrive at the scene until 3 hours after the disappearance was reported. In the context of missing persons investigations, the first few hours are often referred to as the golden hour, a critical window where evidence is freshest and the likelihood of recovery is highest. The delay effectively closed this golden window. By the time law enforcement arrived, the scene at apartment 5A had been heavily compromised. Dozens of people, friends, staff, and police officers had entered and exited the apartment during the initial search. Reports later indicated that basic forensic protocols were not strictly followed in those early hours. For instance, it was alleged that officers smoked near the scene and ash was left behind, contaminating potential evidence. As the search continued into the night, friends and other tourists began to offer information. One witness reported seeing a man carrying a young individual in his arms at approximately 9:15 in the evening, roughly 45 minutes before the mother discovered her daughter missing. This sighting occurred just outside the perimeter of the apartment. This specific witness account became a cornerstone of the early investigation. The description of a man carrying a bundle or a sleeping person away from the resort aligned with the theory of an abduction. However, the reliability of such eyewitness testimony, given under the low-light conditions and without the context of a known crime at that exact moment, would later be debated intensely. From an investigative standpoint, The checking system utilized by the group inadvertently provided a specific time frame for any potential perpetrator. If the checks occurred every 20 to 30 minutes, an abductor would have a clear, albeit narrow, window to enter the apartment, locate the target, and exit without detection. Critics of the parents argue that this routine was negligent, pointing out that leaving young family members alone in an unlocked apartment, even with periodic checks, invited risk. They question why a sitting service was not employed, especially given the professional background of the parents. Conversely, supporters and the parents themselves have maintained that they felt the resort was secure and that their proximity provided a sufficient safety net. The physical evidence at the scene, specifically the open window and the slammed door, supports the narrative of an external entry. If the window was indeed forced open or used as an exit point, it suggests that the perpetrator had been watching the apartment and understood the rhythm of the parents' dinner routine. As dawn broke on May 4th, the reality of the situation had set in. The local police presence increased, but the crucial early advantages had been lost. The timeline established that night from the 8:30 bedtime to the 10 o'clock alarm remains the most scrutinized 2.5 hours in modern criminal history. The events of that evening transformed a family holiday into a complex procedural puzzle, marked by a lack of immediate forensic preservation and a reliance on witness timelines that would shift and evolve over the coming years. In the immediate wake of the alarm raised at 10 o'clock in the evening, the Ocean Club Resort transformed from a place of slumber into a chaotic hub of panic and confusion. While friends and family began a desperate sweep of the grounds, the procedural machinery required to manage a potential abduction stalled at the starting line. According to official reports, the local police did not arrive at the scene until 3 hours after the disappearance was first noted. In the field of criminal investigation, specifically regarding missing persons, the first 60 minutes are widely known as the golden hour. This is the critical window where witness memories are fresh, physical evidence is undisturbed, and the perimeter can be effectively sealed to prevent a perpetrator from escaping. By the time the local authorities arrived, this window had not only closed but had been shattered. Analysts reviewing the case have consistently cited this delay as a grave error, noting that in the majority of abduction scenarios, the outcome is often determined within those initial hours. The delay in professional intervention had catastrophic consequences for the forensic integrity of Apartment 5A. In the absence of a police cordon, the apartment became a focal point for the search rather than a secured crime scene. Friends, resort staff, and fellow guests entered and exited the premises repeatedly, driven by the urgent need to find the missing individual. Later, inquiries revealed startling details about the lack of preservation. A chief of the Portuguese police eventually admitted that vital forensic clues might have been destroyed because the apartment was not adequately safeguarded. Perhaps most shocking to the public was the revelation that officers themselves contributed to the contamination. Reports indicated that some effective personnel smoked inside the room, leaving cigarette ash in an area that should have been treated with sterile precision. This mishandling extended beyond the night of the disappearance. In a move that baffled international observers, the apartment was not sealed off for a prolonged forensic deep dive. Instead, it was reportedly rented out to new tourists on 2 separate occasions shortly after the family departed, potentially obliterating any microscopic evidence that remained. The investigatory failures during the initial phase were not limited to the physical scene. Essential procedural steps that are standard in major investigations appeared to be bypassed. Critics pointed out that investigators failed to check the refuse and garbage bins within the complex, a standard practice to ensure no evidence had been discarded nearby. Furthermore, there was no immediate, systematic review of the guest lists to identify exactly who was staying at the resort. Nor were all guests subjected to rigorous interviews to establish alibis or witness accounts. These lapses were freely exposed in the national and international press, painting a picture of a local force that was overwhelmed and ill-equipped for a case of this magnitude. The failure to secure the perimeter was particularly damaging, given the geography of the Algarve. The region is a short drive from the Spanish border, a gateway that offers easy access to the rest of Europe. While the local search consumed the energy of the resort, the wider net was cast with agonizing slowness. It was not until days later that the alert levels were raised significantly at airports and border crossings, particularly the frontier with Spain, through which an abductor could easily flee. The authorities did notify Interpol regarding the disappearance, and by May 9th, nearly a week after the event, a yellow notice was issued to the 190 member states. However, in the context of rapid international travel, a delay of several days is an eternity. During the first few days, the prevailing hypothesis among the Portuguese police was that the missing daughter was still alive and likely being held within Portuguese territory. This belief may have contributed to a lack of urgency in sealing international exit points, as they initially speculated about a local ring of predators or an illegal adoption network. The friction between the British family and the Portuguese authorities began to simmer during these early stages. The parents and their entourage were accustomed to the rigorous, heavily resourced policing style seen in the United Kingdom. In contrast, they faced a local judicial police force that operated under different protocols and resource constraints. Observers noted that the cultural and language barriers exacerbated the situation. The delay in accepting assistance from British specialists was a point of contention. British police later claimed that the Portuguese authorities' reluctance to accept their support until 3 months had passed significantly hindered the investigation. This period of hesitation meant that specialized resources, such as victim recovery dogs and advanced forensic teams, were not deployed during the time when they could have been most effective. Looking back at this chaotic beginning, it becomes clear that the investigation was fighting an uphill battle from dawn on May 4th. The failure to freeze the scene, the contamination of the apartment, the delayed border alerts, and the lack of immediate, comprehensive witness interviews created a void where hard facts should have been. Instead of a clear forensic trail, the authorities were left with a contaminated room and a cold trail. The golden hour was spent in confusion rather than action. And as the days turned into weeks, the realization set in that the best chance to solve the mystery had likely slipped away before the first police car even arrived at the Ocean Club. The investigation would soon expand into a global media phenomenon. But the damage done in those first few hours would cast a long shadow over every theory and suspect that followed. As the search radius expanded beyond the immediate vicinity of the Ocean Club, the investigation began to pivot from a general rescue operation to a focused criminal inquiry. In the days following the disappearance, the authorities found themselves under immense pressure to identify a viable lead. This pressure culminated in the identification of the first formal person of interest, a development that would dominate the headlines and steer the course of the inquiry for months. The authorities initially operated under the hypothesis that the missing individual was still alive and being held within Portuguese territory, possibly by a network involved in illegal adoption or trafficking. The individual in question was Robert Muret, a British citizen who resided in the Algarve with his mother in a villa known as Casa Liliana, located just a short distance from the apartment where the family had been staying. In the immediate aftermath of the event, he had made himself available to the investigation, offering his services as a translator and a liaison between the local police and the media. While this willingness to assist initially appeared to be a gesture of community solidarity, it soon drew the attention of detectives who viewed his eagerness with skepticism. Investigators began to scrutinize his background and his movements. They noted that he had a daughter of his own who bore a physical resemblance to the missing individual, a detail that they found significant, although he stated he had not seen his daughter for some time following a separation. The suspicion intensified to the point where the authorities felt compelled to act. On the 14th of May, officers descended on Casa Liliana to conduct a comprehensive search. They examined the property in detail and even traveled to the United Kingdom to interview his estranged spouse, his mother, and other witnesses connected to his personal life. The inquiry into his life revealed connections to a 22-year-old Russian national named Sergei Malinka. The police discovered that the two men had exchanged frequent telephone calls during the period surrounding the disappearance, and that the associate had set up a website for the British resident. Officers seized laptop computers and hard drives from the associate, searching for any digital footprints or communications that might link them to the case. However, the analysis of this equipment failed to provide the breakthrough the police were hoping for. Despite the lack of immediate forensic proof, the focus on this suspect remained intense throughout the summer. In early August, a second, more invasive search was launched at the villa. This time, the operation utilized high-technology equipment and specialized canine units trained to detect biological material. Teams excavated parts of the garden and cleared dense vegetation surrounding the property, turning the quiet residence into a major forensic site in a desperate bid to find physical evidence. However, as the excavation concluded, the reality of the situation became clear. No physical trace of the missing daughter was found at the villa, and no evidence was discovered that linked the resident or his associate to the crime. The investigation had followed a path that ultimately led to a dead end. The resident was eventually cleared of all suspicion, but the intense media speculation had already taken a toll. He later sought legal recourse against the press for the defamatory coverage he endured during those months, eventually securing a settlement of $850,000. This phase of the investigation highlighted the difficulties faced by the police, who, in their effort to find a perpetrator, expended significant resources on a lead that dissolved under forensic scrutiny. As the initial weeks of the investigation passed, and the local police in the Algarve appeared to struggle with the lack of physical evidence, the parents of the missing individual made a decisive strategic shift. Realizing that the window for a rapid recovery was closing, they determined that if the authorities could not find their daughter through traditional policing, they would utilize the power of global communication to keep the search alive. This decision marked the beginning of one of the most unprecedented media campaigns in the history of modern criminal cases, transforming a private tragedy into a worldwide phenomenon that would dominate news cycles for years to come. The family, advised by experts in public relations and crisis management, understood that maintaining public interest was vital. In the early days, nearly 200 journalists from major international networks descended upon the resort town, camping out daily to capture every movement of the grieving parents. Rather than shying away from this intrusion, the family engaged with it, believing that the media could be their most powerful ally. They launched a dedicated website, intended to serve as a central hub for information, sightings, and donations. This digital platform allowed people from every corner of the globe to feel personally involved in the search, creating a sense of collective responsibility that transcended national borders. The campaign was sophisticated and relentless. The image of the missing daughter, specifically the close-up photograph highlighting her distinctive eye feature, was distributed on a massive scale. It appeared on millions of posters, flyers, and T-shirts. In a move that demonstrated the reach of their appeal, the image was displayed on giant screens at major sporting events, including Premier League football matches and international rugby tournaments, ensuring that tens of thousands of spectators saw the face of the missing individual. This visual saturation was designed to ensure that the case remained at the forefront of the public consciousness, making it impossible for the world to look away or forget. The crusade to find the missing daughter soon moved beyond the realm of standard missing persons cases and entered the corridors of high power and spiritual influence. In a profound gesture of faith and hope, the parents traveled to the Vatican to meet with Pope Benedict XVI. During a general audience in St. Peter's Square, the pontiff blessed a photograph of the missing individual and offered prayers for her safe return. This meeting was broadcast globally, lending a moral and spiritual weight to the campaign that few other cases had ever received. Simultaneously, the family sought political leverage. They undertook a visit to the United States, where they secured meetings with high-ranking officials within the government administration. The rationale was that the American experience with missing persons cases, often resolved through high-profile media intervention, could offer a blueprint for their own efforts. These meetings were not merely symbolic. They were an attempt to apply diplomatic pressure and to access resources and expertise that were perhaps unavailable in Portugal. The involvement of such high-level figures sparked a debate about the disparity in attention given to this specific case compared to thousands of others involving missing young people who do not receive similar support. The campaign attracted the attention of some of the most famous individuals on the planet. Cultural icons, including authors like J.K. Rowling and athletes like David Beckham, lent their voices and their resources to the cause. They made public appeals for information, urging anyone with knowledge of the event to come forward. Beyond moral support, wealthy benefactors contributed significantly to a growing reward fund. A British entrepreneur and other philanthropists pledged immense sums, driving the total reward for information leading to the safe return of the daughter to over $2.5 million. This influx of financial support allowed the family to establish a fund dedicated to financing the search long after official police resources might be scaled back. It enabled them to hire private investigators and keep the operation running independently. However, this financial aspect also drew scrutiny. Some observers and media commentators questioned the management of the funds and whether the monetization of the search was appropriate. Though the family maintained that every cent was dedicated to finding their daughter. While the campaign succeeded in making the missing daughter the most recognized individual in the world, it created significant friction on the ground in Portugal. The local police force, already under immense pressure, viewed the media circus with growing frustration. They argued that the constant spotlight was counterproductive to a sensitive criminal inquiry. Investigators expressed concern that the dissemination of information and the intense public scrutiny might have driven the perpetrators underground or, worse, caused them to panic. A prevailing theory among some detectives was that if the individual had been taken by a network or a specific abductor, the sheer magnitude of the global attention would make the victim a liability. The pressure from the British media, which often criticized the competency of the Portuguese authorities, created a hostile environment between the two nations' investigative teams. The police felt that the parents' media strategy, while born of desperation and love, was effectively acting as a parallel investigation that undermined official procedures. By the summer of 2007, the atmosphere had shifted. What began as a search for a missing family member had evolved into a complex international event involving diplomats, religious leaders, celebrities, and a polarized public. The face of the missing daughter was ubiquitous, staring out from car windows and shop fronts across Europe. Yet despite the millions of dollars raised and the unprecedented awareness, the fundamental question remained unanswered. The campaign had won the battle for attention, but it had not yet secured the victory of a safe return, and the tension between the publicity machine and the silent, slow-moving wheels of justice was reaching a breaking point. In July of 2007, the trajectory of the investigation shifted dramatically, moving away from physical searches of the surrounding landscape toward a highly technical forensic examination. The British police, seeking to assist their Portuguese counterparts with advanced resources, deployed 2 specialized canine units trained in the United Kingdom to the Algarve region. These were not ordinary tracking animals. They were specifically trained to detect microscopic traces of biological material and the specific scent associated with a fatality. The arrival of these units marked a darker turn in the inquiry, as the authorities began to explore the possibility that the missing individual was no longer alive and that the answer to the mystery lay within the resort itself, rather than with an external abductor. The canine units were tasked with conducting a comprehensive sweep of the primary locations associated with the family. The police judicial team escorted the handlers and their dogs into apartment 5A, the site where the disappearance had occurred months earlier. During this inspection, the dogs signaled alerts in specific areas of the accommodation, detecting what the handlers interpreted as forensic evidence suggesting a serious incident. These alerts were significant because they occurred in a space that had been cleaned and even occupied by other tourists in the intervening weeks, suggesting to the investigators that whatever had left the trace was substantial enough to linger despite the passage of time and human traffic. The search then expanded to include the assets used by the parents. The dogs were directed to inspect the vehicle that the parents had rented days after the disappearance. In a development that stunned the investigative team, the animals alerted to the presence of the same forensic scent on the key of the vehicle and detected traces of biological material within the trunk. This finding was particularly perplexing and alarming to the detectives because the car had not been in the family's possession on the night of May 3rd. It had been hired significantly later. The implication that forensic markers associated with the missing daughter were present in a vehicle obtained after she vanished forced the police to consider a hypothesis involving the concealment of the body. Further forensic work focused on personal effects. The dogs also reacted to the favorite soft toy of the missing daughter, an item that the mother had been photographed holding constantly during media appearances. Fibers from the sofa in the apartment and samples from the toy were collected with extreme care, along with the samples retrieved from the vehicle's trunk and the apartment floor. These materials were packaged and flown to government laboratories in the United Kingdom for urgent DNA analysis. The objective was to obtain a scientific match that could irrefutably link the biological traces found in the car and on the clothing to the missing individual. By September of 2007, the results of these complex tests were returned to the Portuguese police. The findings, however, did not provide the absolute clarity the prosecution needed. The analysis of the DNA samples collected from the car and the apartment indicated a high degree of correlation with the genetic profile of the missing daughter. However, the match was calculated at 88%. In the realm of forensic science and criminal law, an 88% match is considered inconclusive for the purpose of a murder charge or a definitive identification. It suggests a strong likelihood but leaves a margin of error that a defense attorney could easily exploit. The report also introduced ambiguity regarding the age of the biological material. Some interpretations of the forensic data suggested that the blood traces detected by the dogs could have been deposited as many as 7 years prior to the event, raising the possibility that the alerts were triggered by previous occupants or unrelated incidents. This scientific uncertainty created a massive hurdle for the investigators. While the reaction of the cadaver dogs provided a compelling investigative lead and shifted the suspicion closer to the family, the lack of a 100% DNA match meant that the physical evidence was circumstantial rather than definitive. The investigation was now caught between the instincts of the detectives, driven by the behavior of the dogs, and the rigid demands of the legal system, which required absolute proof. This forensic pivot, while generating explosive headlines and internal police theories, ultimately failed to deliver the smoking gun required to solve the case. In early September of 2007, the atmosphere surrounding the investigation underwent a seismic shift. The receipt of the forensic reports from the British laboratories provided the Portuguese authorities with what they believed was sufficient leverage to alter the legal status of the parents. On the 6th of September, the mother was summoned to the police headquarters in Portimão for further questioning. Initially, this interview was conducted under the premise that she was a witness assisting in the search for her missing daughter. However, as the hours of interrogation stretched on, the tone of the inquiry hardened, and by the following day, she was formally declared an arguido, or formal suspect, in the disappearance of her own family member. Her husband was subjected to a similar process shortly thereafter, joining her in this new, precarious, legal category. The declaration of the parents as suspects marked a definitive pivot in the police's working theory. For months, the primary narrative had focused on an external abduction, possibly by a predator or a trafficking network. Now, the investigators, led by the local judicial police, began to construct a case based on the hypothesis that the missing individual had not been abducted at all. Instead, they alleged that a tragic accident occurred within the apartment and that the parents, in a state of panic, had concealed the evidence and fabricated the kidnapping story to cover up the event. This theory of accidental death, followed by concealment, relied heavily on the interpretation of the forensic alerts from the canine units and the DNA analysis, despite the inconclusive nature of those scientific results. To support this new direction, the police scrutinized the statements provided by the group of friends who had dined together on the night of the event. Investigators claimed to have found significant inconsistencies and contradictions in the testimonies given by the parents and their 7 companions. A witness statement surfaced alleging that during the dinner, the group remained at the table for the majority of the evening and that only one person had left the gathering on a single occasion, directly challenging the timeline of regular 20-minute checks that the group had steadfastly maintained. Furthermore, the behavior of the group on the evening of May 3rd was brought into question. Restaurant staff and other witnesses provided accounts stating that 8 bottles of wine were consumed during the dinner, equating to roughly 1 bottle per person. The authorities used this detail to suggest that the consumption of alcohol might have impaired the judgment of the group or contributed to a lack of supervision. Additionally, the police focused on the time frame immediately following the discovery of the disappearance. They noted that approximately 40 minutes elapsed between the moment the mother found the bed empty and the time the authorities were officially contacted. During this window, friends and resort staff entered and exited the room repeatedly. A chaotic period that the prosecution argued provided an opportunity for collusion or the disposal of evidence. The interrogation process itself became a point of intense controversy. The mother later described the experience as coercive and absurd. She reported to the media that during her questioning, officers presented her with a grim proposition. If she confessed to involvement in the tragedy and concealing the truth, she would receive a lenient prison sentence of only 2 or 3 years. She vehemently rejected this offer, maintaining her innocence and asserting that the police were pressuring her to lie to fit their theory because they lacked the evidence to solve the actual crime. On the 9th of September, mere days after being named suspects, the parents made the decision to return to their home in the United Kingdom. This departure was met with a frenzy of media speculation, with some commentators interpreting it as a flight from justice. However, upon their arrival at the airport in the East Midlands, the father addressed the press directly. He stated unequivocally that they had returned with the full authorization and cooperation of the Portuguese authorities. He emphasized that their physical withdrawal from Portugal did not signal an end to their cooperation with the inquiry, nor a cessation of their efforts to find their daughter. Once back on British soil, the couple moved quickly to fortify their legal defense against the serious allegations leveling against them. They sought representation from high-profile legal experts, initially consulting with lawyers known for handling complex extradition and international criminal cases, including the defense of former heads of state. Eventually, they retained a prominent Portuguese lawyer to navigate the specific intricacies of the local legal system. From an analytical perspective, this chapter of the saga illustrates the perilous nature of the Arguido system. While the status affords certain legal protections, such as the right to remain silent, it also publicly brands individuals as suspects before any formal charges are laid. The shift from grieving parents to accused perpetrators created a polarized public opinion that persists to this day. Critics of the police argue that the sudden focus on the parents was a desperate attempt to close a case that was spiraling out of control due to a lack of leads. Conversely, supporters of the police theory maintain that the inconsistencies in the timeline and the forensic alerts required a thorough investigation of those closest to the missing individual. The investigation had now effectively split into 2 opposing realities, one where the parents were victims of a heinous crime, and another where they were the architects of a grand deception. By October of 2007, the tension between the Portuguese investigators and the British parties involved in the case had reached an unsustainable breaking point. The friction was not merely procedural, it had become personal and political. On the 2nd of October, the Director National of the Judicial Police announced a significant change in the leadership of the inquiry. Goncalo Amaral, the chief inspector who had spearheaded the investigation for the first 5 months and who was the architect of the theory implicating the parents, was abruptly removed from his position. The official reason for this dismissal was a breach of professional conduct. The chief inspector had given statements to a newspaper in which he accused the British police of investigating solely to benefit the parents rather than to find the truth. He claimed that the British authorities were effectively shielding the couple. Following his removal, he was replaced by a new commissioner, Paulo Rebelo, who was tasked with reviewing the case with fresh eyes. However, the former chief inspector offered a different narrative regarding his exit. He alleged that his dismissal was the direct result of high-level diplomatic pressure. He pointed to a meeting held in Lisbon in September of 2007 between the British ambassador and the American ambassador. According to his account, this diplomatic intervention was designed to steer the investigation away from the parents just weeks after they had been named formal suspects. This accusation introduced a geopolitical dimension to the case, suggesting that the judicial process in the Algarve was being influenced by foreign powers protecting their citizens. With the original lead investigator gone and a new team in place, the aggressive pursuit of the parents began to lose momentum. The new leadership conducted a thorough review of the existing evidence, including the controversial forensic data. In November of 2008, a team of Portuguese forensic specialists traveled to the United Kingdom to meet with their British counterparts and re-evaluate the findings. The conclusion of this review was pivotal. The prosecutors determined that the forensic evidences, specifically the DNA alerts from the canine units and the laboratory analysis, was insufficient to support a criminal charge. The final report noted that the DNA matches only reached a certainty level of 88%, which falls short of the undeniable proof required in a court of law. Furthermore, the report acknowledged that the biological traces could have been deposited years prior to the family's arrival. Consequently, in a decision that brought a temporary legal end to the saga, the Portuguese public ministry announced that the case was to be archived. This ruling meant that the investigation was suspended due to a lack of evidence that could identify a perpetrator. Simultaneously, the arguido status was lifted from the parents and their friend, effectively clearing them of formal suspicion in the eyes of the law, although the court of public opinion remained divided. Although he was no longer leading the case, the former chief inspector refused to remain silent. In September of 2008, just prior to the official archiving of the case, he published a book titled The Truth of the Lie. In this detailed account, he laid out his comprehensive theory of the events. He argued that the abduction narrative was a fabrication and maintained his belief that the young daughter had died in an accidental manner within the apartment, and that the parents had concealed the body. The publication was an immediate commercial success, selling approximately 120,000 copies within the first 2 weeks. For the former detective, the book was a means to restore his professional reputation and present the evidence he felt had been ignored due to political interference. For the parents, however, the book was a devastating blow. They viewed it as a defamatory attack that presented speculation as fact and hampered the ongoing search for their daughter by convincing the public she was no longer alive. The publication of the book ignited a ferocious legal battle that would span more than a decade. The parents launched a lawsuit against the former detective, arguing that his claims damaged their reputation and, more importantly, harmed the search for their missing daughter. They successfully sought an injunction, and in September of 2009, a civil court in Lisbon ordered a halt to the sale of the book. However, this victory was short-lived. The former detective appealed the decision, and in February of 2010, the Court of Appeal in Lisbon overturned the ban, allowing the book to return to the shelves. The legal ping-pong continued until it reached the Supreme Court of Justice in Portugal. In November of 2010, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the former detective, stating that his right to freedom of expression and his right to express a professional opinion on a closed criminal case outweighed the rights of the parents to their reputation. The conflict eventually escalated to the European Court of Human Rights. In September of 2022, the European Court delivered a final judgment that favored the Portuguese state and the former investigator. The court found that the parents' reputation had already been impacted by their status as suspects during the investigation itself, rather than solely by the book, and upheld the principle of freedom of speech. This chapter of the story highlights the profound conflict between two different judicial and cultural systems. On one side stood the British legal tradition and a family desperate to control the narrative to find their daughter. On the other stood the Portuguese investigative authority, represented by a detective who felt his work was undermined by politics. The archiving of the case in 2008 was an admission that, forensically, the mystery was unsolvable with the available evidence. Yet, the publication of the book ensured that the accident theory remained permanently in the public consciousness, creating a dual narrative that continues to define the case, one of a tragic abduction and one of a tragic accident, with neither side possessing the definitive proof to silence the other. Following the decision by the Portuguese authorities to archive the case in 2008 due to a lack of evidence, the parents of the missing individual found themselves in a desperate position. The official police investigation had stalled. The suspect's status against them had been lifted, but their daughter remained missing. Refusing to accept that the search was over, the family decided to take control of the inquiry. Utilizing the substantial funds raised through their global campaign and legal settlements, They contracted private investigative firms to continue the work that the state authorities had ceased. The most prominent of these collaborations was with a Spanish detective agency known as Método 3. The director of this Barcelona-based firm, Francisco Marco, brought a renewed sense of optimism to the case, which some critics later argued bordered on bravado. In public statements, the director asserted with confidence that the missing daughter was still alive. He propagated the theory that she had been abducted by an international trafficking network and had been transported out of Portugal. The agency mobilized a team that they claimed consisted of more than 20 detectives dedicated to the search. To manage the influx of information, they established a call center capable of receiving tips in multiple languages, including French, English, Portuguese, Arabic, and Spanish. A primary focus of their investigation was the geographical link between the Algarve region and North Africa. The investigators operated under the belief that the proximity of the Portuguese coast to Morocco made it a likely transit route for traffickers. This theory led to intense scrutiny of sightings reported in Morocco. In September of 2007, tourists in North Africa captured a photograph of a young individual who bore a striking resemblance to the missing daughter. The image circulated rapidly, fueling hope that the mystery had been solved. However, the international policing organization, Interpol, intervened to verify the identity of the person in the photograph. After a thorough check, they confirmed that it was a case of mistaken identity and that the individual in the picture was not the missing daughter. This pattern of high hopes, followed by crushing disappointment, became a recurring theme of the private investigation. In addition to pursuing geographic leads, the family and their private investigators sought to identify suspicious individuals seen near the Ocean Club prior to the disappearance. The father released a video statement in which he expressed his belief that the family had been observed by a predator in the days leading up to the event. This theory suggested that the abduction was not a random act of opportunity, but a calculated crime planned by someone watching their routine. To support this line of inquiry, the campaign released artist sketches of a suspect. These images were based on the description provided by a British tourist who reported seeing a creepy man in the vicinity of the resort. The witness described an individual who made them feel uneasy, and the dissemination of these sketches was intended to jog the memory of other holidaymakers who might have seen the same person. However, like many other leads in this complex case, the sketches generated numerous calls but failed to lead to a specific suspect identification or an arrest. The private investigation also explored leads within Portugal that the official police may have overlooked or dismissed. A lawyer named Marcos Aragao Correa promoted a specific search operation focused on the Arade Dam, a reservoir located inland from the coastal resort. Acting on information that suggested the body might have been disposed of in the water, the lawyer organized a search involving divers to scour the bottom of the reservoir. During this operation, the recovery teams retrieved skeletal remains from the depths of the water. For a brief moment, it appeared that the grim reality of the case had been uncovered. However, subsequent forensic analysis determined that the remains were not human. They belonged to an animal. This incident highlighted the emotional rollercoaster inherent in private searches, where raw intelligence often leads to dramatic but ultimately irrelevant discoveries. Throughout this period, the investigation was plagued by a deluge of false sightings from around the world. The intense media coverage meant that people everywhere were looking for the missing daughter, leading to reports from locations as diverse as Malta and South America. In June of 2007, witnesses in Malta were convinced they had seen the girl, prompting police action that yielded no results. Interpol found itself constantly intervening to verify and debunk these claims. The sheer volume of misleading data and well-intentioned but incorrect tips complicated the investigative landscape. Each false alarm required resources to verify, distracting from the core task of finding credible leads. This chapter of the saga underscores the significant limitations faced by private investigators compared to state authorities. While agencies like Método 3 had the freedom to pursue theories that the police had discarded, such as the abduction by a specific international network, they lacked the legal power to subpoena phone records, detain suspects, or secure forensic scenes. Their reliance on paid informants and public tips often resulted in a high volume of noise that was difficult to filter. Furthermore, the involvement of private entities introduced a commercial element to the search. Critics argued that the promise of results by private detectives often outpaced their ability to deliver, raising ethical questions about the industry surrounding missing persons cases. The sightings phenomenon also revealed the psychological impact of such a high-profile case on the public. The collective desire to help resulted in a form of mass pareidolia, where people genuinely believed they saw the missing daughter in the faces of unrelated young individuals across the globe, despite the millions of dollars spent and the global reach of the private investigators. This phase of the inquiry ended much like the official one, with theories and sketches, but without the missing individual. By the year 2011, the official investigation into the disappearance had been dormant for several years. The Portuguese authorities had archived the files, and the private detectives hired by the family had exhausted their leads without securing a breakthrough. However, the parents remained resolute, in a move that demonstrated their continued ability to mobilize public sentiment. They, along with influential supporters, directed their appeal to the highest level of the British government. The catalyst for this renewed activity was an open letter published on the front page of a major newspaper, supported by a petition with thousands of signatures. This appeal was addressed directly to the Prime Minister, David Cameron, requesting a comprehensive review of all information gathered to date. The argument was that a British citizen had vanished abroad, and the state had a duty to ensure that every potential lead had been examined, regardless of jurisdiction. In May of 2011, the British Home Office announced the launch of a new investigative entity, Operation Grange. This task force, led by the Metropolitan Police, Scotland Yard, was funded by a special contingency fund, signaling that the government viewed the case as a matter of significant national interest. Initially, the mandate of Operation Grange was not to launch a new active search on the ground, but to conduct a forensic review of the existing material. The scope of this task was monumental. The team, composed of senior detectives and civilian analysts, was tasked with organizing and translating tens of thousands of documents. These files included the original Portuguese police reports, the findings of private investigators, and thousands of tips from the public that had never been collated into a single database. For the first 2 years, the operation functioned primarily as an intelligence-gathering exercise. However, in July of 2013, the status of Operation Grange shifted dramatically. Scotland Yard announced that their review had uncovered new evidence and new witnesses that warranted a transition from a paper review to a formal, active investigation. Crucially, the British detectives stated they were operating under the working hypothesis that the missing daughter could still be alive, contradicting the earlier conclusions of their Portuguese counterparts. With the investigation fully active, the British team identified 38 persons of interest who warranted further inquiry. Among these were 12 British nationals who had been in the region at the time. The detectives also revisited specific witness accounts that had previously been overlooked. A significant development during this phase was the release of age progression imagery. These computer-generated photographs depicted what the missing individual might look like at the age of 9. This was a strategic attempt to refresh the public memory, acknowledging that the face everyone knew from the posters was no longer accurate due to the passage of time. Furthermore, the investigators broadcast a detailed appeal on television, focusing on a specific sighting that occurred on the night of the disappearance. They released e-fit images of a man seen carrying a young person near the resort approximately 25 minutes before the alarm was raised. This man was described as white, aged between 20 and 40, with short brown hair and a medium build. The police emphasized that identifying this individual was of vital importance, as it could eliminate a significant variable from the timeline or identify a prime suspect. The investigative work culminated in a high-profile physical operation in June of 2014. For the first time in years, a large contingent of British police officers returned to the Algarve, working alongside the Portuguese authorities, who had agreed to reopen their own files. This joint operation focused on specific areas of scrubland located to the southwest of the Ocean Club Resort. The search was exhaustive and utilized technology that had not been available during the initial days of the disappearance. Teams employed ground-penetrating radar to detect disturbances beneath the soil. Specialized canine units were brought in to scour the terrain. The search teams not only excavated sections of the earth but also inspected the complex network of sewers, drainage pipes, and derelict buildings in the vicinity. The theory was that if the missing individual had been concealed nearby, these difficult-to-access areas offered the most likely hiding places. Despite the intense activity, which lasted for 10 days and attracted a massive media presence, the excavations in 2014 did not yield the physical evidence the family had hoped for. The soil and debris analysis offered no DNA connection to the missing daughter, and no items of significance were recovered from the drainage systems. The operation concluded with the site being cleared, leaving the mystery physically unresolved. The scale of Operation Grange also sparked a public debate regarding the cost of justice. By 2022, it was reported that the total funding for the investigation had reached approximately $15.5 million. Critics questioned whether this level of expenditure was justifiable for a single missing persons case, especially when police resources were stretched thin across the United Kingdom. However, supporters argued that the cost was necessary to correct the failures of the initial inquiry, and that the value of a young citizen's life could not be measured in currency. This chapter of the investigation illustrates the complexities of cold case reviews. Operation Grange succeeded in professionalizing the data, creating a centralized archive where chaos had previously existed. It successfully identified thousands of potential sightings and eliminated hundreds of false leads. However, the lack of a physical breakthrough in 2014 demonstrated the difficulty of solving a crime years after the fact, when the trail has gone cold and the landscape has changed. The operation proved that procedural excellence does not always guarantee a result, leaving the investigators with a wealth of information, but without the one piece of evidence needed to close the file. In June of 2020, the investigation into the disappearance experienced its most significant breakthrough in over a decade. Authorities in Germany, working in conjunction with British detectives, announced that they had identified a new prime suspect. This development shifted the geographical focus of the inquiry from the local residents of the Algarve back to the transient population that frequented the region during the mid-2000s. The individual identified was a German national named Christian Brückner, a man with a documented history of serious offenses. At the time of this announcement, the 43-year-old suspect was already incarcerated in Germany for matters unrelated to this specific case. However, investigators revealed that he had been living a nomadic lifestyle in the Algarve between 1995 and 2007. His profile fit the description of an individual who might operate on the fringes of society. He resided in a camper van and was known to undertake odd jobs while also allegedly engaging in burglaries at holiday resorts. The case against this suspect was built on a series of compelling circumstantial links rather than direct forensic evidence found at the scene. The police discovered that on the day following the disappearance, the suspect formally transferred the registration of his vehicle, a Jaguar XJR6, to another person's name. This rapid disposal of a vehicle immediately after a major criminal event raised red flags for the detectives, who hypothesized that the car might have been used to transport the missing individual or evidence. Furthermore, telecommunications data placed the suspect in the direct vicinity of the Ocean Club on the night of May 3, 2007. Analysis of cell tower records indicated that his mobile phone received a call at roughly 7:30 in the evening, just an hour before the parents left their apartment to dine. This call lasted for approximately 30 minutes. The authorities have since made public appeals to identify the person on the other end of that line, believing that this witness could hold the key to verifying the suspect's movements during the critical timeline. German prosecutors took a grim stance on the investigation. Unlike the British police, who maintained a missing person status, the German officials stated they were treating the case as a homicide inquiry. They publicly asserted their belief that the missing daughter was no longer alive, basing this conclusion on the suspect's prior behavioral patterns and specific evidence they claimed to possess, but could not yet make public to protect the integrity of the ongoing legal process. This divergence in classification between the British and German teams highlighted the complex, multi-jurisdictional nature of the case. While the official investigation focused on the German suspect, a separate phenomenon emerged on social media that captivated the global public. Over the years, several young women have come forward claiming to be the missing daughter, driven by physical resemblances and gaps in their own childhood memories. The most high-profile of these cases occurred in early 2023, involving a 21-year-old Polish national named Julia Faustina. This young woman launched an account on the social media platform Instagram with the handle "I am Madeleine." Within days, she attracted over 1 million followers. She posted side-by-side comparisons of her own facial features and those of the missing individual. Specifically, she highlighted a distinctive mark in her right eye, coloboma, which was the most famous physical characteristic of the missing daughter. She also pointed to similar moles on her legs and facial structure. She claimed that she had no clear memories of her early childhood and that her family had been evasive when she asked for her birth documents. The claim ignited a firestorm of media coverage. The young woman demanded a DNA test from the parents, asserting that this was the only way to uncover the truth. A private investigator and medium representing her stated that the parents had agreed to the test, although this was never officially confirmed by the family's legal team. The situation became a spectacle, with the public divided between those who believed her story and those who viewed it as a cruel hoax or a sign of mental distress. In April of 2023, the definitive answer arrived. A DNA test was conducted, not with the British parents, but to determine her heritage. The results were conclusive. The young woman was 100% of Polish descent, with some heritage from Lithuania and Russia, but absolutely no connection to the British family. The claim was proven false. It was later revealed that her own parents possessed her birth records and childhood photographs, which they had attempted to provide to her. This was not an isolated incident. In 2021, a TikTok user named Maddie, also known as the Brazilian Madeleine, made similar claims based on physical similarities, only to be debunked by the fact that she was 21 years old when the missing individual would have been 18. Similarly, in 2018, a university student in Manchester went viral with claims that she was the missing girl, later admitting it was a joke that went too far. These incidents underscore the unique psychological impact of this case. The missing daughter has become such a ubiquitous figure in global culture that people project their own identity crises onto her image, often causing renewed pain for the grieving family. Throughout the nearly 2 decades of this investigation, a parallel trial has taken place in the court of public opinion, often fueled by a sensationalist press. The relationship between the parents and the media has been one of extreme volatility. In the early days, the parents utilized the press to launch their global campaign, but the narrative quickly turned against them when they were named suspects in 2007. The British tabloids, in particular, were ruthless. Following the lead of the Portuguese police's initial theories, newspapers published articles suggesting that the parents and their friends, dubbed the Tapas 7, were involved in a cover-up. These stories alleged everything from the disposal of the body to participation in swinger lifestyles, claims that were entirely unsubstantiated by evidence. The coverage reached such a fever pitch that it became difficult for the average citizen to distinguish between verified police findings and tabloid speculation. The parents fought back through the legal system. In 2008, they initiated libel proceedings against a major newspaper group. The High Court in London ruled in their favor, acknowledging that there was no evidence to suggest they were responsible for the death of their daughter. The newspapers were ordered to print front-page apologies and pay $583,000 in damages. The friends who dined with them also received substantial settlements for the defamation of their characters. All the proceeds from these legal victories were funneled directly into the official fund to continue the search for the missing daughter. Despite these legal victories and the fact that they were officially cleared of suspect status by the Portuguese authorities in 2008, the stigma has persisted. A segment of the public remains convinced of their guilt, a belief sustained by internet forums and the enduring impact of the initial negative coverage. This chapter serves as a stark case study in the ethics of modern journalism. It raises the question of whether a fair investigation is possible when the media has already decided on a verdict, and how the lives of victims can be irrevocably damaged by the very institutions supposed to help tell their story. After tens of thousands of documents and millions of dollars spent, the investigation essentially boils down to three primary theories that have been debated, dismissed, and revived over the years. To understand the current state of the case, one must objectively analyze these three distinct possibilities. The first theory is that of a burglary gone wrong. This hypothesis suggests that an opportunist thief entered the ground-floor apartment, likely through the unlocked patio door or the window, intending to steal electronics or cash. Upon entering the bedroom, the intruder may have woken the young individual. In a panic to silence her and avoid detection, the burglar may have abducted her or caused her harm accidentally and then removed her from the scene. This theory is supported by the fact that other apartments in the resort had experienced break-ins, but it is weakened by the lack of forensic evidence, typical of a panicked struggle. The second theory, and the one currently favored by German prosecutors, is that of a targeted abduction by a dangerous criminal with a predatory history. This narrative posits that the individual was watched and selected. The suspect, Christian Brückner, fits this profile. The window of opportunity, the brief intervals between the parents' checks would have been sufficient for a local individual who knew the layout of the resort to enter and exit quickly. The sighting of a man carrying a bundle near the apartment supports this, although that sighting has never been definitively linked to the German suspect. The third theory remains the most controversial. The hypothesis that the parents were involved in an accidental death and a subsequent cover-up. This was the conclusion of the initial Portuguese investigation led by Goncalo Amaral. It relies heavily on the reaction of the cadaver dogs and the alleged timeline inconsistencies. However, this theory has a significant logical flaw. It requires the parents to have disposed of a body in a foreign country, while under intense police and media surveillance, within a matter of hours or days. Despite the dog alerts, no physical body has ever been found, and British authorities have consistently stated there is no evidence to support this view. Each theory possesses pieces of the puzzle that fit, but each also has pieces that are missing. The burglary theory lacks a body, the abduction theory lacks a confirmed witness to the act, and the parental theory lacks a plausible timeline for disposal. The truth likely lies in the missing pieces that have been lost to time or destroyed in the initial chaotic hours of the investigation. As we approach the end of this chronicle, the case of the missing daughter from Praia da Luz remains open, a sprawling mystery contained within 12,000 pages of official police files. It is a story that has spanned nearly 2 decades, involving the police forces of 3 nations, the United Kingdom, Portugal, and Germany, and has cost taxpayers more than $15 million. Yet, the central questions remain unanswered. Where is she? And what happened on that night in May? For the parents, the search is a daily reality. They have weathered accusations, legal battles, and the cruelty of false hope, yet they maintain a vigil for their daughter. They have stated repeatedly that until there is a body or a confession, there is hope. The fund established in her name continues to operate, ensuring that the investigation does not end simply because public funding dries up. The legacy of this case extends far beyond the family. It has fundamentally changed how parents view safety while traveling. The concept of leaving young family members alone in a room, even for a moment while dining nearby, is now viewed through the lens of this tragedy. It has also changed the way the media interacts with missing persons cases, highlighting the power of viral campaigns, but also the destructive potential of unverified information. In the end, this is not just a story about a police investigation. It is a story about the void left behind. The missing individual would now be a young adult. Her image is frozen in time, a permanent fixture in the collective memory of the world. Until new physical evidence is found, or a confession is secured from a suspect like the German national, the disappearance remains an open wound, a mystery that refuses to be solved, leaving the world to wonder if justice will ever truly be served. And that brings us to the end of this extensive analysis of one of the most complex and heartbreaking criminal mysteries of the 21st century. We have walked through the timeline, examine the suspects, and analyze the conflicting theories that have kept this case in the headlines for so many years. This story serves as a reminder of the fragility of safety and the enduring pain of uncertainty. While the investigators continue their work behind closed doors, the public remains a vital part of keeping the memory of the missing individual alive. I would be very interested to hear your perspective on the theories we discussed today. Do you believe the answers lie with the new suspect in Germany? Or do you think the truth is still hidden in the archives of the original investigation? Please share your thoughts in the comments section below. I ask that we keep the discussion respectful and considerate of the human tragedy at the heart of this story. If you found this investigative report informative and value this type of in-depth coverage, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking this video. Your support allows us to continue bringing these important stories to light. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next criminal history investigation.